Welcome to another episode of the RevOps Lab. We are here with a returning guest, Gabe Rothman. Hey, Gabe, how are you?
I'm doing great. Yeah, it's great to see you guys again. Looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah, same here. So I think as a podcast, you're growing older when you have people returning. We very much enjoyed our first show together. But maybe, before we start, and as we've grown quite substantially over the month, maybe you can give a quick intro. Who are you? What do you do? And then we jump right into the topic.
Sure. Yeah, as you said, Gabe Rothman, I'm the Vice President of Operations at Rescale. Rescale is an orchestration platform to run basically engineering-driven computer simulation on public cloud high-performance computing. So the example I always like to give to kind of like frame it up for people is we have a lot of automotive companies as customers. And so probably the two biggest categories of simulation, or two of the biggest categories of simulation in automotive, are computational fluid dynamic simulation, so like wind tunnel testing, at least wind tunnel testing in the context of automotive, and crash testing, right? Simulating crashes that don't actually have to destroy an actual automobile before they get to the final phases, right? So that's kind of what we do. And we're sort of the connective layer between the public cloud and the simulation software. And then there's a whole bunch of feature functionality built out around that as well.
Well, it feels like we could just continue on that topic because I think for Philip and me, it would be very interesting to dive into that type of software. But our topic today is architecting an enterprise-ready tool stack and build versus buy analysis. And I want to jump into the first question. And I think we know this, right? I actually today just posted on my first attempt to a RevOps maturity model on LinkedIn. So if anyone has any thoughts, it's the V1. I'm going to incorporate the feedback for V2. But I think, when it comes to tool stack, right, usually as the organizations grow, the tech stack changes. And so I'm curious, if you were to, build a go-to-market tech stack from scratch, what categories would you add in what order? How would you approach it? I know it's a big question, but yeah, super curious. What do you think?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it depends on where the company is when you start that process. So if let's say you're brand new startup and or close to brand new, and you have a vision for RevOps that early in the company's evolution, which would be great. I think most companies frequently don't, which is fine, makes sense, right? You want to focus on engineering and sales generally that early. But if you do, and you're starting, pretty close to from scratch at that point, obviously I focus a lot on foundational elements. So, the obvious answer as a starting point is CRM. I happen to be a Salesforce person. I think, reasonable minds can differ, but I would start with CRM. And then because you're so early and you're going to be sales focused, I think you could probably go with these two in any order. But again, more likely to have your early salespeople on board than your early marketing people on board at that point. So probably a prospecting. I know that's very sort of tactical and not necessarily like what you would think of as a foundational element. But I think it's important to arm your salespeople very early. So when I say prospecting, obviously there's a lot of things that fit under that umbrella. I think initially I'd be focused on like the data enrichment side or the prospecting, like anything that gives you access to your actual potential customers. So things like LinkedIn Sales Nav, ZoomInfo, or other like data providers. And then moving on to marketing automation once you're starting to bring on the marketing folks, right? Because that obviously CRM gives you the sort of repository to house basically all of your company information, right? Your CRM is where every customer originates ultimately. And then prospecting, giving you the ability to find people, find out who you need to be talking to, and marketing automation, getting that rolling early is also critical, so you can start talking to your market. And then from there, then I would start to spread out. Again, whether or not some of these additional tools are needed, reasonable minds can differ, but I'd probably then, after marketing automation, move into some sort of like prospecting automation tool. But again, it depends on the size of your sales team. Do you have are you starting to build out a BDR team? But like a sales loft or an outreach, or alternatively, I would maybe look at getting into some of the like call intelligence and activity capture. The sooner you start getting that stuff into your CRM, the better in some respects, because you can start to learn about like, what does a good sales cycle look like? What does a good call look like? What does our sort of golden motion look like from an activity point of view? It's hard to know that stuff if you don't obviously have the data to look at it. Now, the challenge there is when you're really early, you obviously don't want to jump the gun, because that stuff may not be useful at all to you, for a number of reasons, not the least of which is you could pivot entirely, because early startups do frequently pivot. You can change your entire messaging or positioning in the market pretty frequently and quickly. So obviously you want to make sure you evaluate where the company is at from those points of view when evaluating this stuff. And then down the line, I think these are things that these last two things are things that you probably look at as the company starts to hit a much more mature state. You have a pretty solid kind of North Star from a product perspective, marketing and like messaging perspective. But then I might start looking at things like forecasting and then business intelligence tooling. BI tooling is something that once the company gets to a certain level of maturity, can be very important to give you insights into what's happening. But there's a long period of time as a company is evolving through its early stages that you don't really need it. You can get the reporting that you need, the sort of table stakes reporting that you need from your CRM or some combination of CRM and frankly like Excel and Google Sheets. So I think BI is more of like,
but
there's a certain sort of maturity index you want to hit. Forecasting, I have mixed feelings about. I know a lot of people use lots of forecasting tools. I've used them in the past. Again, I think it's just a matter of maturity to some extent, but also really evaluating like, what do you actually need? I mean, we at Rescale, we used a forecasting tool for several years and ultimately decided, you know what, we don't think this is giving us a whole lot of additional value beyond the ability to just structure a meeting, a forecast call around the most critical deals and have a discussion about it. And so we actually deprecated that, and we've just been using Salesforce forecasting for at least 2 years now. And it's been very effective for us. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. But again, it depends on where the company is.
So I have one thought and then one more question on as a follow-up here. Obviously, super curious about the forecasting as we play in this space. We always say, forecasting is actually the outcome, but what the input is really good data. So activity capture, CI, right? And then good deal hygiene that ideally needs to be automated, because the reality is that often it's just not happening if you don't automate it, right? So contact intelligence, activity intelligence, conversational intelligence that ideally auto-populates all the fields on your methodologies, so you have better understanding of what's actually going on, so you can quickly review deals to inspect and then also take action, right? And then that feeds basically, the forecasting and sales analytics layer, and ideally is deeply integrated into Salesforce, right? So this is basically what we've built with Weflow, and we still don't know really how to talk about it best. I think this is like still a challenge for us, right? Like, but it goes like way beyond. I think if you think about your prospecting example and prospecting automation, it's very clear how to use a cadence. But then if you think about how to actually manage deals and manage your pipeline, it is very up to like the individual to do that effectively. And so how do you provide more structure as a workflow, as an intelligent and smart workflow solution that ideally has all the data so you can act on them, right? So that's just some like thoughts on that space that I think is fundamentally changing. One follow-up question on the stack. So one topic that often comes up is CPQ. How do you see that? Does that play a role as well? And then the CPQ, I think, has evolved also a bit. Like, it's not just configure, price, quote, but it's actually quote to cash process. So I'm curious how you see that specific category now.
Yeah, actually, before I answer that, I want to respond to what you just said, though. I think that's a really good point, because I think what forecasting means has evolved a lot, as you pointed out, right? Even 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, forecasting meant forecasting, right? You get on a call, talk about the deals. And I think we're all aware of this convergence in functionality around forecasting, activity capture, right? Like Gong started as call intelligence, and they've added other forms of activity capture, and now they're rolling in forecasting. We used to use Aviso, was the forecasting tool that we use. They started primarily as forecasting, and they've rolled in call intelligence and activity capture, right? So all of these tools in that sort of suite are converging on kind of a common feature set that is now this combination of intelligence, activity, reporting, forecasting. So that is a good point. So yeah, when I was referring to forecasting, I was really talking about just the like actual forecasting piece. So I do think that having tools that enable you to capture all of that like critical intelligence about how your company actually goes to market, that is lost at an individual level if you don't capture it in some structured way. I think it's important for sure. In terms of CPQ, I think that some type of CPQ-like functionality is obviously indispensable. You have products, you have to quote, you have to send out order forms, you got to get them executed. You have to configure that stuff in your CRM to know what you sold to people. So in that respect, it's almost like a non-negotiable feature. Now, whether you use Salesforce CPQ or DealHub or some other tool, I don't have very strong opinions on it, honestly. I think it's important to sort of know what is going to work for your company. And I would say more broadly, my thinking about, and this sort of actually in a sense ties into the kind of build versus buy stuff that I think we might talk about a little later. My thinking on tools in that respect has evolved over the years. When I first got into this world, I was very like, all these tools are so cool. It's so neat that you can like buy all these things that can solve all these problems for you and do all this really interesting stuff. And I still think that that's cool. But one of the things I've realized over the years is that some of these things that are, I apologize, guys. My dog is whining. I don't know if you can hear that.
For the listeners, right, there was like a dog walking around in the background for a while. Now it's in the corner. And
sorry about that.
What's his name?
We can edit it. His name is Ghost.
Okay, nice.
He just came in and he was just like whining and whining and whining, and I can hear him. He's distracting. All right, I'll start that part over. Yeah, in terms of CPQ, so at Rescale we use Salesforce CPQ. I think one of the reasons that we went with Salesforce CPQ instead of like an external tool goes back to what I was just talking about around this sort of evolution of my thinking about having all these tools to do all of these sort of very specific focused roles within your stack. I've started to lean back towards a more consolidated tools approach, right? So not having so much sprawl, not having people in the organization have to use so many different tools or go into so many different places, especially AEs, trying to keep AEs working out of one place as much as possible for a variety of reasons, to keep sort of all the data in one place, to keep their focus in a single place, right? The more sort of different types of activities and places that you're requiring your salespeople to go to effectively sell, the more, I think, fractured and potentially like friction you're going to have in your sales process. So that is to say that we went with Salesforce CPQ again to keep people in Salesforce. Obviously, it is very tightly connected into the sort of opportunity structure. The other reason we did it, though, is that we have a really interesting and sort of complicated business. We sell some subscription type products, but like fundamentally we're a consumption model. And so the way that our products need to be structured in SFBC requires a high amount of customization because there are things that we need to be able to do. Like we have a whole suite of SKUs that have pricing, but no actual value that makes sense, not in terms of the opportunity. So because they're consumption products, right? So like computer like core infrastructure, right? There's a price, we quote the price to the customer, but the price just tells them what they're going to pay when they consume, right? So it doesn't actually like roll up into the op. So just as an example of things we've had to customize heavily to make sure that our CPQ works for our product suite.
But I think what I'm hearing here is also in like the pricing here for your product. It's like a core part of your business, right? This is not like you sell a seat for your solution for $50 per user per month, and so that's like a basic model. And you don't need to build something custom in order to cater to that need and requirement. But your case is quite specific. So if you were to purchase, like a solution, most likely you would end up in a situation where the vendor makes some promises and then actually ultimately is having a very hard time to deliver. You become a burden for them. They will have to constantly scramble to satisfy you, and in the end, no one will be happy. This is sort of like what I envision.
What are you talking about? That happens?
I mean, that's SaaS, right? Like, I mean, to some extent, if you have like not a good like match of expectations and reality, and the vendor is not honest about it, and also the buyer is not really thinking it through fully. So I think like with a business like Rescale, I think in that regard, like this question of build or buy, it just makes so much sense. And kind of like for me, it's like what you said earlier, right? It depends on where is the company at, what is the underlying business model and product. And I think as a RevOps person, you need to be like honest to yourself, like, and really evaluate, like, because I mean that's a huge purchasing decision for a bigger company. Right? That basically is change management and is involved there, like the finance team. That's not just sales, right? That's a lot of different teams. So that's a decision you got to be really, really, really careful about. This is not like, do you buy Chili Piper or some other scheduling solution? Like that you can like switch out, and it's not like super crazy if you make a mistake here. Yeah. So just wanted to add that because I think it plays into this whole like build or buy question a lot. Yeah.
It does. And that, I think CPQ is actually a great example for that discussion, because it's, for that reason, a very sort of like multifactorial decision. Because it's not just how much customization are we going to need in our CPQ, for example, in order to serve our business needs. Obviously, that's a big piece of it. And, if the vendor, to your point, can't evolve the solution to fit your needs, assuming it doesn't fit your needs from the outset, it's going to be slow, frustrating. But the flip side of that is, do you have the capabilities within the company to own a solution like CPQ and evolve it to fit your company's needs? Because if you don't, then you're in a similar position in that you can't do it. You can't do it either way, right? You certainly can't evolve someone else's third-party solution, at least not any more than is available within the constraints of their product. We know how flexible Salesforce is, but again, we also know what a double-edged sword that can be, right? You can kind of do anything with it, but you need the capabilities to do that. So if you don't, then you're faced with a decision, well, we need to hire that capability, which, in my opinion, people should always hire to have that capability. I think relying on external like consultants and vendors, which is the second choice, right, is bring in a consultancy to build out that customization, is worse than going with the inflexible software solution, because now you have something that literally only that consultancy can manage. You have no insight into the mechanics of what's happening under the sort of like behind the curtain. And you have nobody whose sole focus is managing that thing, right? At least if you buy a tool like DealHub, for example, at least that is what that company does, right? Their whole existence is to support that tool. I have my opinion. I think that if you're faced with that situation, if you're faced with that situation and you're like at the point where you need CPQ and you're deep into the evaluation and you don't have the capability, and now you realize you need to hire someone, that's not a good position to be in because it's going to take a while to hire someone. But I think that goes back to staffing. I think you should always have at least one person in your company who is a true technical expert on this stuff. So yeah, it's a little bit of it can be a catch-22 if you're not properly staffed and prepared for it.
I think like basically if you work with an external agency, and I think external agency is totally fine, right? Like I'm not going to hate on them. It's definitely a spicy take, but I think that's good. Because it is a decision that you need to think through. And I think if you want to work with an external agency that does Salesforce development or HubSpot development, whatever, for you, you need to have a product person in-house that is able to build acceptance criteria, catalogs, and does QA and really understand it. Otherwise, you shouldn't, right? Like if the agency basically tells you, oh, no, don't worry about it. We have like a project manager that they will take care for you.
Just don't do it. Yeah.
I just don't. Yeah. So
I 100% agree.
Yeah.
You have to know what was built, right? When that project is delivered, there has to be somebody internally that can tell you exactly what was built, and not just like, oh, it does these things. Like, what did we actually put into our system? For sure.
Yeah. So
I will say, we did use an agency in our initial CPQ implementation, but we worked very closely with them, and that's actually a great distinction, which is that like CPQ is a beast, and we have at Rescale a lot of internal technical capability around Salesforce and the Salesforce ecosystem, but not around specifically CPQ, right? So we brought an agency in basically to help make sure that we didn't like fall into any traps or screw anything up. We worked with them, and then when that was done, we knew exactly what was built. We worked hand in hand with them. They told us all of the like gotchas to look out for. And after the implementation, we knew our entire system. We were able to take it from there and run with it. So I think you're absolutely right. It does have its place, but it needs to be very strategic. It needs to be a very tight feedback loop. I think the notion that you can ever just sort of like throw something over the fence to an agency and say, just do it. It's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Not
this was just my thinking, right? Like it's this dream of like, okay, I don't need to deal with it, and then it's gonna be all good. But I think that's just fantasy, right? I think in reality it doesn't work that way, and I think you have a lot of ripple effects and what we call opt step, right? Like that basically then triggers. I'm curious, right? So all this discussion, right? It always is in context of your go-to-market motions, right? Like very different if you're high touch versus low touch, whether you're inbound driven versus outbound driven, whether you're product led, right? Pricing, consumption versus seat based, like is or like completely different pricing, like that all has a big impact on all these decisions. But what I'm curious of is like would you say that you need this kind of a vision, right? Like to basically know, hey, look, this is where we want to be in 2 years, and this is how we're going to get there? Or is it more an iterative approach, or both? Yeah.
I tend to lean more iterative because, my whole career I've been in startup land, and I mean even at Rescale, where we're a pretty mature company at this point.
Just for the listeners, how big is the company now? I mean, you don't need to disclose revenue, but like we're approximate size.
Yeah, I think we're around 175 people, something like that. It's fluctuating, hiring and whatnot, but around 175 people. We're Series C. And we're should be announcing maybe another round here coming up, but as of right now, we're Series C. Even 2 years ago, we were in a pretty different place than we are now in terms of like our overall company strategy, not just in terms of the product and the vision for the company, but I mean, even in terms of like our financial posture. I think a lot of companies were, especially 3 years ago, right? The VC and investor environment has changed a lot in that time frame, and investor expectations have changed a lot, and the way companies are run has evolved. The way that we're run has evolved. We've become much more efficiency focused. Cash flow positivity has become a much more emphasized factor than just pure growth. And so that changes the way that you view everything across the company. But in the context of this conversation, it very much changes the way you view your stack. We've carved a ton of spend out of our tools stack over the last 2 years. And so I think it's good. It's always good to have a vision for how you want things to evolve. But I think, especially at startups, you can't help but be iterative. And to that point, I think I forget if Philip, it was you or Giannis, it was you earlier. We're talking about tools that, like, I think you mentioned Chili Piper, right? Nothing against Chili Piper, but it was a good example of like, it's a great tool, but it's like the type of tool you can plug and play, right? If you use it and you decide, you know what, this isn't for us, or just not getting enough value, whatever it is, and that could be Chili Piper as a like generic stand-in for any of these tools, right? We're not picking on Chili Piper, but
love Chili Piper.
Yeah. But with those types of tools, like if you have to rip it out, it's not that big a deal. You could literally turn it off and it's fine. Like nothing's gonna blow up, right? In your go-to-market motion. So from that respect, I think you can also sort of split the way that you think about those things, right? The core foundational elements of your stack, obviously you should be as strategic as you possibly can about. You should have a vision and at least a mental roadmap, if not literally a written roadmap of how those things are gonna evolve. And then the other stuff, iterate on it, experiment, try things. I mean, over the years, we've tried a bunch of tools that we used for a year or even a couple years, and then said, yeah, you know what, we're fine, we're good. I mean, we've had tools that were more heavily integrated into our stack that we kind of played around with and then removed and replaced. The example I'm thinking of is a tool called Tray, Tray.io, which is a great tool. Actually really liked it. And we used them initially because we had some need around integrating Salesforce with Jira. With Asana. We had a weird period of time where, like, I don't know why this predates me, but some of our engineers were on Asana and some were on Jira. And I was like, what are we doing, guys? What's happening? So, so we had this integration that we needed, and we used them to do a bunch of orchestration around basically the field team being able to request stuff from engineering from within Salesforce, and then having a feedback loop with Asana and ultimately Jira. And so that was living in Tray for a long time. And eventually we moved off of Tray and onto a tool called Syncery. And the reason primarily is not that Tray wasn't a good tool. It's a very good tool, but Tray is very like point-to-point type of an integration. So with Tray, none of the integrations have any sort of like awareness of any of the other integrations, right? It's kind of like, I never know how to pronounce it, but Zapier, I don't know how they pronounce it, on steroids in a way, right? It's a lot more robust, but similar concept, right? Like you just have, I'm going to integrate Salesforce to Asana, Salesforce to Jira. I'm going to integrate Redshift to whatever, right? And the challenge is, as our integration needs got more and more complex, the data piece started to become messy, right? Because you're like, I don't know where any of these data concepts are mastered anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And so we switched to Syncery because Syncery stores data. It has its own database, right? So everything integrates into Syncery and then out. So you can develop more of like a golden record concept, or at least a centralized concept of an easier way to make sure that all systems have some sort of like quote unquote awareness of identifiers and like account customer concepts across tools. So that's an example of like a pretty heavyweight solution, complex build out, stuff that we put a lot of time into, that we decided, you know what, this isn't the right thing for us anymore. And we, it took some elbow grease, but we replaced it. And again, love that tool. Syncery is working really great for us. So that's the type of stuff where I think it's always a sort of, again, multifactorial analysis, right? You could rip and replace almost anything. It's how significant is the need, how much value you're going to get out of it, how much work and effort is it going to take to replace it, right? Like Salesforce, we're never, ever, ever, right, going to rip out Salesforce.
Don't say that too loud. Your account executive might be listening.
That's how I talk to them.
Yeah.
They know it. They're not dumb. They know it.
Yeah, they know it for sure. Sorry. Yeah.
So Gabe, just curious, like maybe we could like go through it like as an exercise, like so let's say, right, there is a need to purchase a new type of software, and like there's a need to solve for a certain pain point that exists at your company, and you are evaluating whether you want to buy or want to build. Like, how would
I have
you
a
actually
great example
like?
for you.
Okay, perfect. Let's work.
Yeah.
Let's work through this. Yeah.
I could speak about it, not in the hypothetical because we're doing it right now. So, okay, I'm going to give you a little history, but on this tool category, and then I'll talk about what we did. So, this actually dovetails nicely with our last interview, which is commission planning, right? So we used a tool for a while. I can never remember what it was originally called. I think they were either acquired or just renamed at some point to a company called Vericent. And so like the early history of that tool was when the ops team was very small at Rescale, and I didn't have the bandwidth to manage a commission tool. Finance came to us and said, hey, we want to get a commissions tool. And I said, great. I'm happy to support it technically, but you guys have to own the like actual implementation. And then fast forward, the main stakeholder for that tool left, and it was never really developed appropriately. And so we looked at it and we're like, well, we're already customers, and we knew we needed at that time a broader sort of like more supported implementation. And so we said, well, let's just stick with these guys. At that time, they were working on re-platforming the tool. So they were making a bunch of changes, and they said, hey, we'll give you some amount free while we're re-platforming, blah, blah, blah. We said, great, that's fine. Very long story short, it didn't work for us. And we decided, we're going to cut bait. That was mid-year in 23. And so we realized, well, if we're going to go through a whole evaluation to find a new tool and then buy something and implement it, we're in July now. We're not going to be done with that until, at least the end of August, if not September. That's like the end of the year. Like, does it really matter for commissions for the remainder of 2023? Finance can continue doing what they're doing for the remainder of the year. So instead, we built out basically like a POC of like a homegrown commission system in Salesforce and used it in Q4 just to see, does this work? Do people like it? And it worked pretty well. It's all Salesforce automation and custom objects. And so it worked well, so we used it this year. And we've had a couple of like hiccups here and there, but overall it's been very effective. Fast forward to now, we're at the end of the year, we got 25 coming up, we're doing commission planning. And one of the things we realized that is a challenge with that tool is it works great, but I built it and we don't have anyone else on the ops team that can manage it. But because it's complicated, I built the whole thing. So anytime we need to make changes, especially on the automation side, I have to go and do it. It's not the end of the world, but it's a lot of work. And I have to get involved every time we have any type of like a non-standard type of a commission scenario. Like we have to do an override, or we need to like remove and rerun a bunch of commissions for whatever reason, right? So it is scalable from the point of view of like when it's running, and we're not making changes. Very scalable solution, right? It runs great. It does not require a lot of maintenance, but from an evolutionary perspective, an iterative perspective, it does. And so, but looking at it from that point of view, and also the point of view of like, we like our gallows humor at Rescale. We call it the bus problem, right? If I get hit by a bus, like, what do we do? So we're evaluating commission tools now. We're almost certainly going to deprecate the homegrown system and move on to a commission tool. And I think that's a totally appropriate evolution, right? We took a look at a homegrown solution. We knew we had the internal capabilities to do it. It worked. It saved us money if you don't count all of the many hours of my salary that went into building that went into building the homegrown one. But again,
But
it's one of those things where like you need to you don't want to waste effort and money, but you also can't be too precious about the things that you build or your stack or even tools just because like a certain subset of people really like it. I mean, that's not a reason. That is a valid reason to keep something. My point is that like you don't want to like fall into sort of like some cost fallacy or like I said, get too precious about the things that you built. But I think it provided the value for us that we needed at the time, and now we need to go in a different direction. Is that a helpful example, Philip, for kind of what you were thinking of?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, you basically just went through the whole thing, and from buying to building back to buying, right? And I fully agree. I think it's an totally okay choice to make. I think as long as you make it consciously, right? And I think that's the tricky thing, and to think it through. And the fact that in your case, basically now you are the bottleneck is also like a good reason to switch.
Yeah, I also think one other thing to think about there too is like, especially when you talk about like, we bought and then built and then now we're going to buy again. When thinking about buying too, it's very easy to get starstruck by like bells and whistles, right? But it's really important to think about like, yeah, that's cool, but like, do we need that? Are we ever going to use that? Like, what is the minimum viable version of this thing that we need to run our business? And how long can we run on the minimum viable thing? And can we build the minimum viable thing in-house? And how much effort will it take to build that, right? So, just because something can do something doesn't mean that you need it for that. It's easy to get lost in that stuff.
Yeah, I think the way I would sum it up is like, okay, so what does it cost to buy versus build, right? And you have to include the entire cost of building it, right? Which means maintaining it, building it out, right? Like further iterating on it. How long is it going to take, right? So what's your time to market, right? Do you actually have the in-house expertise to build it, right? And then what's the lock-in? Whether you build it, right? Like you have to maintain it, you have to iterate on it, or whether you buy it, right? And I think these are all considerations that are extremely important. I mean, I think we are like so fed up with this whole like, oh, I don't give pricing. So, like if you go out and purchase software, right? Like, okay, make it transparent, right? Like go through like ideally like test the software, right? Play around with it, have a clear understanding of the requirements, and also ideally the roadmap and how that matches, get an understanding of, your support model, and be very, very realistic about it. And then one thing I heard, I think it's some podcasts, and I really like that, is like what a company has done is basically, look, we didn't actually decide to stop using the tool. We just said, let's just stop using the tool for a month and see if anyone screams. I really like that, because I think it's like like sometimes like the perception in the ops is maybe very different to in the field, right? And so you basically pause a tool and then you see whether people are screaming. And if they do, then well, maybe it's not so good to rip it out, right? And you do that before your renewal periods end. So you have that information. I really like that. Just wanted to share that as well. But I think we have to actually end it here. Like we're already way over our normal time, but happens to the recurring, guests, I guess. Philip, do you want to ask Gabe our closing question? I think we changed it, so maybe.
Yeah, we changed it in the meantime, which is good, thankfully. So Gabe, so what is one book that you would recommend to our listeners? I want to say there's one disclaimer though. You cannot say revenue architecture. That's forbidden, because too many people said it in a row. I think three or four people said it in a row. So
that is a good question. Does it have to be about RevOps, or can it just be any book?
I mean, if you want to
I'm
recommend the kind of the release notes of Salesforce, I mean, that's fine, right? That's also good.
Well, weird, but yeah.
I would recommend. I would recommend two books. So there's one that our CEO recommends, and I think literally every QBR that we've had for the last 2 years, he, as part of his presentation, he brings it up every time. And I understand why, and it's measure what matters, right? All about OKRs. And why, use that structure and whatnot. Really, really great book. I just think it's a great framework for thinking about how to do all of this sort of iterative type of work, regardless of whether it's engineering or involving the whole company or RevOps or whatnot. And then another book that I really like, it's an older book and it has nothing to do with business specifically, but it's a really interesting book about the way the human mind works. It's a book called Phantoms in the Brain. And it's by, I think the author's name is V.S. Ramachandran. He's a neuroscientist. And it's a super interesting book about, again, it's a discussion of like how the brain works, but it's built around all of these sort of psychological anomalies that happen in various people. So the title refers to phantom limb syndrome, and so people who have amputations and still feel like their limb is there. And it talks all about why that happens, and it's just super interesting. And some of the examples are wild in the book. There's this one example of a woman who has a blind spot in her vision, and her brain started hallucinating cartoons in the blind spot. And it's wild. So great book. And it's a great, just sort of interesting education on like how our minds work.
Yeah, love it. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we'll have to create like a blog post on getweflow.com/resources, where we put all our RevOps resources. I think we also need to add like just a list of book recommendations we collected so far.
Yeah.
Very good.
Right. Thank you so much, Gabe.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Always a pleasure.